Welcome to this episode of Chatting the Pictures. My name is Cara Finnegan, and I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I'm a writer, a psychologist, and also the publisher of Reading the Pictures.
This episode is focusing entirely on images from the coronavirus crisis. And in this episode, we're going to talk about images that really tap into the social and cultural aspects of the pandemic. Our first segment we call The News, and here we're interested in how news photos tell a story.
This photograph was circulated by the Vatican News via the Associated Press, and it shows Pope Francis delivering his weekly blessing to an empty St. Peter's Square on Sunday, March 15th.
To me, the key theme really of this image and a lot of the images that we've seen, especially over the last week from Europe and now in the United States, is emptiness. In the context of the pandemic, what's not there really is a visual theme of the crisis.
If there is an image that marks the institutional, moral, religious, and social impact that the crisis has had, especially on Italy, where the outbreak has been so serious, this is the photograph.
There will not be a public mass at the Vatican for Easter, which is the highest holiday of the Christian calendar. That unprecedented choice to essentially remove Christian practice from public view really highlights the moment that we're in. That key kind of iconic figure of the Pope blessing essentially an empty square, where the only other human figure that you really can see in this image is the reflection of the Pope himself in the windows to his left and right.
It feels like the photograph plays to different emotional states that we're moving in and out of. I think that the photograph is an inspiring one and talks about the test of faith and the Pope showing up and maintaining ritual even in this dire moment. Also, it's a scary photograph. It also speaks to the limits of faith. I think it speaks to both ends of the emotional response to what's going on. I thought what was also really interesting about this photograph was the geometry of it, both the rectangle and then the circle in the square. And my theory would be that this photograph also got the circulation it did. There's so much geometric structure in this photograph, and what do we need right now more than anything is a sense of structure, organization. I think that the photograph, not just morally, but also geometrically, delivers that as well.
You could even take the circle and see it replicated in the Pope's cap. I'm also struck by the way that the viewer in this photo is positioned to be inside, as if we could all step back with the Pope and close the windows and protect ourselves. And in a context where a lot of people all around the world, and now newly in the United States, are being asked to distance themselves socially, and in some cases, shelter in place or self-quarantine, this image I find poignant for that reason as well, as if we could all back up and close those windows to potentially protect ourselves. Our next segment we call The Look, and here we're interested in how some photos push the visual boundaries to illuminate a story or an idea.
So this photograph was taken by Alessandro Grassini for the New York Times, and it shows citizens on their balconies in Milan, and in this particular case, they're encouraging doctors and nurses who are responding to the virus. Just like the last picture, I think that the geometry is also really interesting, and the picture certainly is about order and social order out of disorder.
This photo really amplifies this theme, I think, that we're seeing pop up in a lot of the social and cultural discourse about coronavirus. And that theme is alone together. So this idea that we are all in this together and everyone has to do the right thing in order to protect the most vulnerable among us. But at the same time, people are still isolated and isolating, and they are alone, or in some cases, just living with their family unit. There were two visual analogies I made when I first saw this image. The first is those holiday calendars where you might be, for example, an eager child checking off the days before Christmas, and each day you open a door on the calendar and you pull out a treat or a piece of chocolate. And so the kind of various openings of the doors and windows here really made me think of that. The other kind of analogy that this image also invokes for me is this idea of kind of the Hitchcock rear window, the idea that you're looking into people's secret lives, and as their lives, their inner lives, their interior lives play out on a more public stage. This photo, I think, highlights the more exterior aspect of that, right? That if the last photo showed us inside with the Pope, this photo shows us looking at people revealing themselves in their situations.
Another thing this photograph does is it really speaks to the human spirit, inherent optimism. We're hearing a lot of crisis and the media is amplifying a lot of fear. But I think this photo is really reflective of something different, something that's being overlooked. So what you're seeing in this photograph and many, many others that we've looked at, especially from Italy, are people on balconies, photographs of singers and musicians performing, groups singing. You're seeing people chatting and communing. My sister-in-law actually happens to live in Rome, and there is a tradition in Rome, or in Italy, called the passeggiata, where everybody comes out at 6 p.m. and they walk. My sister-in-law was telling me that at 6 p.m. every evening now, with them all absolutely locked down, people are coming out on their balconies at that hour, and sometimes they'll sing, and sometimes they'll holler, and sometimes they'll clap, and that's not necessarily even to each other, but it's what the Romans do.
What I love about that story is that it's tied to cultural practices that exist already, right? So that people are turning to the kind of inner cultural and social resources that they know, that matter to them, that they grew up with. And those become resources in a time of trauma, which is really important, I think. Our next segment we call The Pick, and here we're interested in what photos get public traction.
This photo was taken by Tyler LaRiviere for the Sun-Times. The St. Patrick's Day parade in Chicago was canceled Saturday amid fears of the spread of coronavirus, though people still flocked to River North to celebrate on Saturday, March 14th. I think it's important to also say that the governor of Illinois didn't announce that restaurants and bars were closing until the day after this photograph was taken. So at the time, the general advice at that point was still about making sure you're washing your hands and avoiding the elderly, but people were still, at least in Chicago, able to congregate.
They were, but they had also been advised against it. So again, as with a lot of the photos we've seen from this crisis so far, the only thing strange about this photograph and what's happening in it is the context of coronavirus. Any other St. Patrick's Day weekend, this would be a kind of B-roll photo of a bunch of young people gathering outside bars and restaurants in Chicago, getting ready for the parade, having a good time, maybe drinking one too many. But obviously in the context that we're in, it reads very differently. And one of the things I've gotten interested in with these kinds of images is how they invite us to think about citizenship. These young women who at any other moment would be viewed as young people rightly having the opportunity to have some fun on a Saturday, now this image can really be interpreted as putting others in danger. These women are not flattening the curve. It all highlights the extent to which we are now coming to see public interactions differently. And then what it means to be a person in public is starting to get tied to moral judgments about your behavior.
Youth and omnipotence seems to be a dimension of the crisis, at least as we're in this transition point between lesser and greater restrictions. And then it's also an interesting photograph from the standpoint of the statistics so far in terms of the spread of the disease, where younger people are not being afflicted as much as older people. And then this fact that what we're really realizing now is that they can be carriers, though. So need to be mindful of their contact as much as anyone else, even if they're not getting sick like everybody else.
I think that idea of you literally don't know who might have the virus and be able to infect others. It's really punctuated by the shamrocks, the Lucky Bride t-shirt and then the little beanies and the headgear with the shamrocks on it. That kind of irony of luckiness and who is lucky, I think that really comes across in this photo too.
Whereas a demonstration like this might not be much different any other year, what it's infused with is the incredible impact of trauma and how stressful that is not to be able to interact socially and for that to happen almost overnight.
Yeah, it really does make you wonder to what extent images like this read as the last hurrah. That's it for this episode of Chatting the Pictures. Be sure to check out our companion episode looking at political aspects of the crisis.
If you're watching this during the crisis, we hope that you stay safe. And if you're watching this months or years from now, we hope it brings the experience in these days more into focus. Take care, and we'll be with you again in 2 weeks.